protecting the police every single day.
Directed verdict, Teeter vs. Project Veritas. In 2016, Democratic political operatives' dark art of orchestrating violence at Donald Trump rallies was just one example of the lengths to which they were willing to go. At one rally, an older woman, and a Democratic activist, Shirley Teeter, claimed a Trump supporter had cold-cocked her at a Trump rally during his 2016 presidential campaign. Scott Favell, a prominent Democratic activist at the time, claimed credit for orchestrating these protests. An agent of Democracy Partners argued, and Project Veritas published this claim, Teeter was one of Democracy Partners' bird dogs, meaning she intended to create an incident. Teeter then sued Project Veritas and Project Veritas Action. With a gang of 4 high-priced, high-powered lawyers, the disabled, elderly woman waged a campaign of costly federal litigation. On the second day of the trial, at the request of the judge, our lawyers made an oral argument for a very rare Rule 50 directed verdict, believing the plaintiff had not presented a credible case. The judge heard the oral arguments on the directed verdict motion from both sides, and he ruled against Teeter. Effectively, the judge ruled that the jury could not possibly have ruled in favor of Teeter. If citizens and the media are handcuffed by a fear of liability, that's detrimental to political discourse, it is detrimental to society as a whole, and it is detrimental, really, to our fundamental freedom. If I've gotten this wrong, and the Fourth Circuit says that this is not what the law is, I hesitate to think where the First Amendment is going in this country. United States District Court Judge Martin K. Reading, May 2019. This case ultimately centered on a battle between emotion and the First Amendment. To be successful, Project Veritas lawyers Michael Montecalvo and Jamie Dean made a sweeping defense of the First Amendment. Project Veritas continues to execute the court's assessment of costs against Shirley Teeter.
Happening now in Asheville, the trial over a lawsuit against a right-wing group known for using disguises and hidden cameras to uncover alleged bias and corruption. A disabled woman is suing Project Veritas,
who claims she was then libeled in a video
produced by Project
Veritas and founder James O'Keefe.
Shirley Teeter says the group released a video 1 month after the assault. She says that video led to online threats, which made her fear for her safety.
So we're in the middle of this week-long jury trial. I'd never been in a jury trial. I mean, it was the most adrenaline, nerves, stress with the jury, which I had helped pick the jurors. It felt like I was gambling on a roulette wheel, and for that reason I couldn't sleep for 2 days. I believe that this is an attack on the First Amendment and the press in general by people who politically disagree with us, and we will be victorious. So we're in the middle of a jury trial, and it was really extraordinary, almost like To Kill a Mockingbird level stuff. You had this extremely sympathetic plaintiff, and I think the opposing lawyers were betting on this issue because our side couldn't figure out what law or facts existed that would prove a case. So we're day 3 in, and we come into the courtroom, and we sit down, and the federal judge, a guy named Martin Reitinger, he decided to put the brakes on. He decided to just shock everyone and issue this ruling that would make First Amendment history.
With regard to the motions pursuant to Rule 50, and I wanted to let you know kind of what I had in mind with regard to the motions that were made on behalf of the defendants.
So the day before, we had called these 2 witnesses to the stand. The plaintiff rested her case, and our case brought our witnesses. And there was only 2 witnesses. They were only 20 minutes long, and it was, I think, 4 or 5 o'clock, and the judge said, let's try to get these 2 witnesses in before we rule on some motion stuff. So these 2 witnesses just had some things to say that questioned Shirley Teeter's credibility. They testified that she walked up to her assailant and touched him on the shoulder, and he sort of swatted her away. Some things that questioned her or impeached her credibility. And then these 2 witnesses were done being cross-examined by the plaintiff, and the judge had to hear arguments for something called a Rule 50. Now, I'd never heard of a Rule 50 before. I didn't even know what it was. Apparently, it's an opportunity for the judge to throw out the case before it goes to jury verdict. That means that there is no evidence whatsoever that would lead a reasonable jury to find our guilt. So at that moment, Jamie Dean my attorney is blind. I mean, literally 100% blind. Gave this unbelievably passionate, articulate, organized, coherent argument before this judge. He's unbelievably brilliant, and he had memorized all these cases, Supreme Court cases, appellate court cases in the Fourth Circuit. Jamie had two arguments: that there wasn't any actual malice, there couldn't be any malice, and there wasn't any defamation per se. There was a scene change, there was a point in the video where we transitioned to talking about something else, and the opposing counsel was saying that everything in the video defamed Shirley Teeter, even things that were said minutes later. And Jamie just decimated that argument because he said there was more than one possible interpretation. So therefore, there was no defamation. For 30 minutes, this man, who's carrying a walking stick in court, stood up and made this argument, and I was in awe. I mean, I was staring up at Jamie, and the judge seemed, to me, to be in awe. He was just sitting at the bench, just listening intently without interrupting him. And then I was waiting for the judge to interrupt Jamie, but he never did.
Your Honor, the burden of proof can't be ignored in these cases. The First Amendment requires a heightened burden of proof. The Supreme Court has guided that burden of proof must be considered on a directed verdict. So, a scintilla of evidence isn't sufficient. There has to be enough evidence that a reasonable juror could find clear and convincing proof. Ms. Teeter has not met her burden of proof. She's had her day. She's presented all the evidence she wanted to present. We would argue that the story here, even if Ms. Teeter had denied that she was one of Mr. Fovel's activists, that doesn't undermine the value of the reporting. The story is that Mr. Fovel took credit, that a highly placed Democratic operative took credit for Ms. Teeter, and that has relevance in the news, even if Ms. Teeter denies it.
So what this lawsuit was about, we had released these videos in the 2016 presidential election, and it showed this high-level operative, dirty tricks operative, working for Americans United for Change, itself working with a group called Democracy Partners. And this man named Scott Fovel, we filmed him referring to a woman named Shirley Teeter. Now, Scott Fovel did not mention Teeter specifically by name.
But she was one of our activists. She was one of your activists who had been trained up to bird dogs.
This is a pretty significant thing, that we were being sued by Teeter. When I first got the lawsuit, I thought, why isn't Teeter suing Scott Fovel, who made all the claims about her? And she sued us. So it was sort of, our methods were on trial, and also this absurd notion that we're being sued for what we reported somebody else saying. In the judge's verdict, one of the things that has struck attorneys around the United States is just how clear he makes the constitutional implications in this particular case.
I believe that the First Amendment implications also extend to a greater degree in a case like this. The free exchange of ideas requires a very broad latitude for the media, particularly on issues of great public importance. And at the top of the list would be an issue regarding who should be elected as our president.
It doesn't matter what the frickin' legal and ethics people say. We need to win this motherfucker.
Hillary, is aware of all the work that you guys do, I hope.
The campaign is fully in.
And then they tell Hillary, what's going on.
Well, Hillary knows through the chain of command.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting we wait around. We need to start this shit right away.
Okay.
On every one of these fronts.
Okay.
Therefore, if citizens and the media are handcuffed by a fear of liability, that's detrimental to political discourse.